We are barely a month into the VCT 2025 season, and yet we are already seeing some teams making pretty big roster moves. Rosters that only have a handful of official VCT games under their belt are already being decided that this is not working and there needs to be changes. And the reactions to these roster moves have been quite mixed, but at least from what I've seen, mostly negative. A lot of people talking negatively about the orgs involved, some people talking negatively about the players involved, and for me, it got to a point where I was getting so annoyed with the discourse around these roster moves and a bunch of other things about it that I had to make this video. So today what I'm going to be doing is not just talking about the roster moves that have happened so far themselves, but also talk about the whole discussion around them. Because I feel like we've gone to a point with these VCT roster moves that it just seems to always be negative, and I don't really understand it. So this is the board we have today. So we have the roster moves that have been announced or leaked, and we also have some past moves that we're going to talk about, but I'll reveal those later. So starting with the two arguably biggest roster moves, we have the switch up that Energy is doing. Energy had a very good offseason. They rebuilt the roster by bringing in two new young players in both Mada and Verno, two players that have made their way through North American Tier 2 and performed quite well not only in Tier 2 but also on the team when they joined. And they bring in a new coach in Bonkar to be the replacement for Chet, and then there's all this drama around Bonkar and Chet and Bonkar talking smack about Chet in the Energy podcast and Chet crashing out and responding. It was just a whole mess that honestly doesn't make anyone look good. Chet was definitely overreacting. Bonkar was also being rude for like no reason, saying that he actually understands the game more than Chet did, and I just felt like, man, he nearly won champions, he won an international roster, you've been a tier 2 coach for a while. I wouldn't be talking a lot of smack right now if I were you. And now we have the change where Bonkar is no longer the head coach of this team, and Verno is also off the roster. And this came as a huge shock when it was announced. I was really surprised by it. I thought I was getting trolled at first, but then it ended up being real. And then eventually we learned what the replacements were going to be. In place of Verno, we have Brock coming in. He was on Shopify Rebellion, previously MXS. So he's a former teammate of Mada, so you already have that built-in chemistry there. And he can play Initiator quite well. So maybe when you look at just pure skill and mechanical skill, maybe Verno is better, but it was clear to the other players in Energy that Verno just was not cut out for Tier 1, at least at this stage. Verno and Energy had an amazing offseason. They won 2 tournaments in the Sin City Classic as well as the Super League Valorant tournament in Korea, so it looked like this roster was primed for a really big year. They have a roster with a good mix of experience and rookies, and then kickoff happened. They lost their opening match, they won their second match, but then they got out of the tournament by losing to Crew. So it's a disappointing result for this team, but overall, it's the start of the year, it's kickoff, it's double elimination, there's little room for error, and you're a new roster, and there should still be time for you guys to figure this out. However, with this change, a lot of the players that are still on Energy have cited that it just doesn't seem like Verno is ready for Tier 1. Not to say that he doesn't have the mechanical skill to play in the VCT, he definitely does, but there seems to be an issue with attitude and competitiveness when it comes to Verno. And that was definitely something that they didn't outright say in the Energy podcast when they talked about this roster move, a podcast that I don't think they mentioned Bonkar in, which was kind of surprising that they didn't do that. They didn't explain why the coaching change happened, so that's still kind of just up in the air. And then fans started doing some digging. They looked at interviews that Verno did, and he basically said, a lot of you have probably seen the clip already, where he basically just doesn't care. He doesn't seem to take the game very seriously. He wants to retire early. He doesn't really do much with this time. He doesn't like play ranked outside of practice, which isn't a huge deal. Some players don't do it, but a lot of them have more storied careers at this point. Verno being a rookie, it just seemed like the competitiveness, the fire just was not there. And Energy is a team that needs that fire on their team. This is FNS's last year of professional Valorant, maybe Psalms as well. So having a personality on your team that just doesn't seem to care, even though if he does care and he has the mechanical skill to be a fantastic player, that's probably super frustrating. There also seems to be an issue with communication. When people looked at like their comms video, they found that Verno said the least out of everybody. So while the public doesn't exactly know what happened, it seems pretty clear that there was some kind of attitude and motivation issues there. So if Verno figures those things out and realizes that he can't just coast and just hope to like retire at a super young age by just being a god gamer, making all this money really easily, winning everything, and then just, painting them up. He has to care more, and once he does, maybe he ends up being back in tier 1 and becomes an insanely good player. I do hope for him that one day we see that. Maybe another tier 1 roster picks him up and gives him another chance is very possible. But the Verno roster change overall makes a lot of sense, and bringing in Brock, it could potentially be an upgrade. Verno did have a rough kickoff, much different from his very strong offseason, but Brock might end up being more consistent than Verno, and Brock has been waiting for his tier 1 opportunity for quite a long time now. He finally gets this opportunity with energy. I highly doubt he's going to waste it. I think Brock is going to have a really strong season for them. However, the coaching change definitely seems like a pretty big issue here. So they kick out Bonkar, and Bonkar was Verno's coach back on Oxygen Esports, so maybe they were a package deal. Maybe that is why he is also out. Maybe it was his decision. The info around Bonkar doesn't seem to be as clear as the info around Verno, but they end up doing this coaching change and they bring in Mike's HD, or I guess just Mike's is what he's going by now. And this is definitely an interesting pick. So he was the coach for Envy back in 2021. That was, of course, the first version of the Optic roster that had a very good 2022, but they were also quite good in 2021. So he did find success on that team, but then he moved on to 100 Thieves. He started as an assistant coach. He ends up getting moved to the head coach role in 2023, and 100 Thieves proceed to have probably their worst season yet. It was honestly just an absolute disaster for that team. Not that I would put that solely on Mike's. The players are ultimately what matters, but the coaching role is very important. We've seen really good coaches come into teams that seem to be a bit dismantled and end up having a really huge and positive effect on the team. Think of Kaplan being made the head coach of Sentinels. I think he's one of the best coaches in Valorant right now, and his presence on the team I think is the main reason why Sentinels have been so good for the past 2 years and continue to be solid. So we'll see how the coaching change ends up affecting Energy and their performance overall. There is potential with Mike's. There is some familiarity with FNS there, so maybe that becomes an asset. So this to me seems like a move that is mainly catered to FNS and his leadership and his style of play. So you can see that as a bad thing, that FNS still has a lot of control over this roster, but FNS has had success before. If he gets the team that he wants, if he gets the style of play that he wants, then maybe this ends up working out very well for Energy. But one thing I wanted to talk about with this is not just what the roster changed, the implications of it, and what happened behind it, is also the community reaction. So a lot of people at first were just very negative towards Energy about this. Not that that response at first was undeserved. This is a very confusing roster change if there's no explanation given, and I do commend Energy on at least giving some kind of explanation instead of just leaving fans in the dark, because that is a very frustrating thing. But obviously fans are always going to overreact to these things, especially if the teams have a big fan base, and that can be very frustrating. A lot of fans will not give the team the benefit of the doubt, even when it's something that maybe they should. And while I definitely have my problems with how some teams and organizations make their roster moves, whether it be the timing of it, whether it be the players involved, I've definitely clowned on C9 for doing this exact thing. But context to me is the most important thing, and one thing that it seems like players, at least some of them online, seem to not want the public to have is that information, is that context. One response that I see from players or former players or personalities in the scene that are more on the player side is them acting like people speculating on the roster moves and people talking about it in the way that they do is this huge terrible thing. When roster moves happen, people are going to speculate, and a lot of players online will respond with, all these fans are speculating and they don't know anything of what's going on. You don't know anything. You shouldn't be typing online and questioning all this stuff. And I know that that's a hyperbolic way to explain what their online reaction is, but I think it's ridiculous to expect fans to just not talk about things, to just not speculate on what's going on. Obviously making up conspiracy theories and all this stuff, that's definitely very annoying, and I understand that all that online talk can get very negative and really annoying for players to deal with. It is still going to happen. These are fans of your team. They deserve an explanation. These are people that are investing their time and sometimes their money into your team to cheer for you. So as much as you don't like people prying and trying to find out what happened and making up stuff as well, that stuff, again, it can definitely be very annoying. I understand the frustration, but to ask people to just not to do it and just shut up when it comes to roster changes, no, that's just not going to happen. If you don't want people to speculate, give them an explanation. If you don't want to give an explanation, then accept the consequences of it. And I'll get to a bit more about this later, but I'm going to go through some of the other roster changes as well. Some other roster moves that are happening. Talon is benching 2 of their players. In both Ban and Governor, we don't know the replacements that are coming in yet. There's probably rumors and there's probably scrim leaks, but I haven't seen anything to that effect. But this definitely seems like a curious move from a team that did end up getting 4th in their respective kickoff tournament, and they did walk away with the championship point in that kickoff tournament, so maybe making a roster move, you can look at it from 2 different sides of that. This team wants to be qualifying for international tournaments, especially with Bangkok being in Thailand and this being a Thai team. That was definitely very disappointing for them not to be able to make it there. So the team did not perform up to snuff, and in the offseason, Talon were definitely okay, but they've always kind of just been that, a team that is okay, definitely has some good pieces on there, but nothing spectacular. Even them making it to champions last year was based off of Primi coming in and having a kind of secret weapon vibe to it, but the team was never really consistently in the top 3 of the region or anything like that. But I don't know if they're going to find players in between now and stage 1 that are going to put them in, say, the top 3 of the region. While there are some teams in Pacific that are definitely underperforming or off to disappointing starts, it's still a pretty good region. DRX, T1, Genji all look like they're going to have good years despite Genji falling short. And they also have their own rumored roster change. Foxy9 hasn't been scrimming with the team, but Foxy9 also said on Twitter that he's not kicked out, so we'll see what ends up happening there. But I'm not going to judge this roster move too much. Ben and Governor, they're good players for sure, but they are still at least a little bit expendable, and it's all just going to be based off of who they bring in, so we will see. Moving on to the last recent roster change that we have to talk about, Leviathan is kicking Natank off the roster and bringing in Rossi. So this is definitely a very interesting move. Natank was the EMEA import that this team had. Previously a member of Gentlemates, moves on to the Leviathan roster to play in North America, so he basically just uprooted his whole life to come here, and now he's being kicked off the roster in favor of another player that was kicked off of a tier 1 roster. So this is another one that has a lot of negativity around it, a lot of people saying that Leviathan is a terrible org for doing this, how could they do this, why aren't they swapping out Demon 1, saying that they should have done this with the roster, they should have done that, and I definitely understand the anger there, I understand the negativity, but when you look at this roster move on paper, is Rossi an upgrade on the tank? I say probably. Rossi had a very good offseason with C9. He had a good year with T1 before that. He can be an IGL. This team doesn't need an IGL, but maybe they're having a bit of problems with communication. So he could step into, say, a mid-rounding role or something like that. And again, he had some very, very good performances on C9 before he was kicked out. So while I understand the negativity, honestly, I think this is kind of a good move. I feel bad for Natank, and he's a good player as well. He deserves to have another shot. But maybe Leviathan just saw Rossi available, thought that that was an upgrade, and decided to pick him up. So as we've established, when roster moves happen, usually they are met with negativity right away. And while on the surface, you may think of roster moves as a thing that doesn't really work if you do it mid-season, people probably thinking that teams that do this usually don't win. Usually teams that are consistent are ones that have rosters that stay together for a long time. So I wanted to look at some past moves and offer a bit of a different perspective. Starting with a roster move that happened last year that did not end up working, so could be used in the argument of roster moves are bad to do mid-season. Energy with what they did last year. So what Energy ended up doing is swapping out Demon 1 and Marv for FNS and Som. So they brought back FNS and Som, who were on the roster in 2023, and that team was decent. Energy made a lot of roster moves in that offseason after the 2023 season, and looking back, they seem pretty unnecessary. They didn't end up having a true IGL. They had Ethan in that spot. He was not very good in it. Demon 1 had an amazing year on Evil Geniuses, and then on Energy just could not find his game. And then Marv, after spending some time on Sentinels the year prior, came to this roster and everything just did not work out for him. So they bring back two players that probably should have stayed on the roster overall, and it did not work. However, they kept those two players for the roster that they have now, so we'll see if these roster moves actually end up working out, because it's still kind of up in the air. So far, it has been a failure. It was a failure in that stage 2, it was a failure at kickoff, but these are two players that still have something to give. FNS, his mechanics are definitely not what they once were, but Som is still a very solid player. But overall, this roster move did not work, and maybe if Energy kept the roster that they had during stage 1, would it have gone better? Overall, I kind of don't think that it would have. It just seemed like there was something broken with that roster. So that's one roster move that did not work out, at least in the short term, but I definitely want to bring up something because there is a Champions winner that made a mid-season roster change, and that is the most recent Champs winners, in Edward Gaming. Edward Gaming, after having some poor performances at international tournaments in 2024, losing out early in Madrid, losing out early in Shanghai, that one being much more embarrassing being on home turf, they decided that they needed a change. So they moved Howdon to coaching, they bring in Simon. It was a massive gamble and it ended up working. It was exactly what this team needed. Simon was very solid for them, and having that new player, that new style of play that a lot of teams weren't expecting from Edward Gaming, it paid off in spades. So a mid-season roster change, at least in this example, worked out swimmingly for them. And that's not even the only champs winner that made a mid-season roster change. Very famously, Evil Geniuses swapped out BCJ for Demon 1, so Demon 1 shows up again. And this ended up being exactly what they needed. BCJ was seen as the player that they shouldn't have swapped out. He had a good year on XSET the year prior, but as soon as they brought Demon 1 in, this guy was absolutely insane. I really hope Demon 1 2023 isn't forgotten anytime soon. That guy was just lights out. Really hope he finds that game again, but that was the main reason why not only did they win champs, but they went to back-to-back grand finals. So while you can think that doing roster changes mid-season can be a terrible thing and something that can ruin your season, it can also help you win the entire championship. And when it comes to coaching changes, that can work too. We saw with Leviathan last year, they had their head coach Goked. Him and the team mutually agreed to part ways, so they made their assistant coach, Itopata at the time, the head coach. And that was after their disappointing early exit at Shanghai, and the team ended up being way better in Stage 2. They were a really solid team in Stage 1, but then in Stage 2, they were the best team in the whole region. And then they ended up making top 3 at Champions, so they were 2 matches away from that grand prize. So what is the point of this video? Why did I make it? Why am I talking about it? I mainly just wanted to highlight that I think when it comes to roster changes, both on the side of the players and how they react to it and how the public and the fans react to it, I just think everyone overreacts all the time. Obviously, there are roster moves that seem very, very frustrating. Again, I've brought up C9 before. I could have filled this board with C9 changes, but I decided to not because most of them didn't work out. There are plenty of examples of roster changes either going poorly or not working out, but there's also examples of it making a team win the ultimate prize. So I don't think that us as a community should always demonize these orgs, demonize the players that are remaining on the team that made said changes. Obviously, these orgs and the players, they deserve to get criticism for these kinds of things, but I don't think that we should just immediately think that everything is terrible when something like this happens. And I also don't think that people should think it's bad that fans are speculating on what's happening. I think that's a completely ridiculous request. Anyway, that's all I have to talk about. This is a pretty rambly video, so sorry about that, but maybe I got a point through. Let me know in the comment section down below, what do you think of the roster changes that are happening recently? What do you think of what I talked about in this video? Let me know in the comment section down below. Please click like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye!